Casino security decided to humiliate Chuck Norris right at the gaming table. But a second later, the entire room froze in shock, and the bodyguards instantly regretted their decision. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. The Mirage Royale never truly slept. Its heart beat in neon and glass, and the rhythm of that pulse was steady, unbroken, relentless. Inside, the air was cool and thick, with a scent that hovered somewhere between perfume, smoke, and the faintest trace of citrus that the air conditioners whispered into circulation. Slot machines spilled out their artificial songs like a choir of metallic birds, the clatter of dice and chips blending into a symphony of chants. The room itself felt alive, not in the way of nature, but in the way of machinery, a river of money, adrenaline, and unspoken hopes, flowing endlessly beneath a sky of chandeliers. Amidst this noise, a man walked in quietly, almost unnoticed, though the very act of his entrance seemed to shift the room's energy. Chuck Norris was not dressed for spectacle. He wore a plain denim shirt tucked neatly into faded jeans, boots that had seen desert roads, and a weathered cowboy hat that shaded his eyes from the riot of light. He moved as if he had no hurry, yet each step carried a certainty that made space for him without effort. People stepped aside though they weren't aware they'd done it, like ripples parting around a stone dropped into water. He passed the roulette wheels with their crimson hum, past the rows of polished slots blinking with false promises, until he reached a blackjack table tucked in the middle of the floor. He placed himself in a chair with the quiet finality of a man who belonged where he chose to sit. His hands rested loosely on the edge of the table, broad, steady, and untroubled. When the dealer asked what he'd have to drink, he didn't order whiskey or champagne, as most men in the Mirage Royale did when they wanted to be seen. He said simply, "Tea." The dealer blinked, surprised, then nodded and sent a server. His stack of chips was modest, unpretentious, bought without flourish or noise. But when the first cards fell, something subtle happened. The room didn't slow exactly, but its hum shifted, as though leaning toward the quiet man who played with the precision of someone measuring not odds but rhythm. He wasn't counting cards, nor did he chase the rush that burned in the eyes of the tourists and the high rollers. Chuck played with patience, a stillness that turned each decision into something deliberate. And somehow, the cards seemed to notice. They favored him gently, not with spectacular wins that made others gasp, but with a steady current of fortune that kept his pile of chips growing like water rising slowly in a glass. The dealer, a middle-aged woman with practiced hands and sharp eyes, tried not to let it show, but she found herself glancing at him with a different kind of attention. Players came and went, their moods swinging between laughter and curses. Yet this one man remained unchanged. When he won, his face hardly moved. When he lost, it was the same, as if the money itself mattered less than the act of playing correctly with respect. At first, no one paid much attention. The Mirage Royale had seen every type of gambler, from the desperate to the reckless to the lucky. But as the minutes passed and the stack of chips before the cowboy-hatted stranger grew higher, whispers began. A pair of tourists elbowed each other and pointed, wondering if he was someone they should recognize. A young man filming for his social feed paused, phone tilted, catching a frame of the mysterious winner. The quiet confidence radiating from him did not demand attention, but it drew it all the same. Around the edges of the room, however, there were eyes that did not see with curiosity, but with irritation. The Mirage Royale prided itself on control, every outcome, every glance, every smile carefully managed. And there were men who made sure it stayed that way. At a corner booth near the velvet ropes, a cluster of large men in dark suits watched the cowboy as he played. They were not gamblers, not tourists, not staff. They were the shadows of power, bodyguards whose presence was not official but always understood. Their job was not only to protect, but to intimidate, to remind anyone who got too lucky or too loud that the house remained master of the game. One of them, a thick-necked man with close-cropped hair, narrowed his eyes. "Guy thinks he's slick," he muttered to the others. "Sits down, wins without sweating. People start staring. House doesn't like that." Another smirked, swirling his drink. He's just some old cowboy. Luck runs dry. It always does. Shayroom. The first one leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the table. Maybe, but he doesn't play like a fool. Doesn't play like he cares about the money either. That's the kind that makes crowds believe in ghosts. The others chuckled, dismissive, but the unease remained. The Mirage Royale tolerated winners, of course. It had to. But there was a kind of winning that unsettled the balance, a winning that made people question the inevitability of the house. Chuck Norris, though he sat silent and small at his table, carried exactly that weight. Back at the table, the dealer slid 2 cards across the felt toward him. Chuck glanced at them once, then placed his chips with a movement so economical it seemed practiced 1,000 times. The dealer turned the next card, a 21. The surrounding players groaned, and one cursed under his breath, but Chuck only inclined his head politely, as though acknowledging the rhythm of a song no one else could hear. The cocktail server returned with a small pot of tea and a porcelain cup, something rarely ordered in this den of liquor and bravado. Chuck thanked her quietly, poured, and sipped, steam curling upward in a calm ribbon. Around him, the room was a storm of lights, voices, and chants. Yet somehow in that storm, he sat like an unmoved rock in a rushing river. And that stillness, more than the cards or the chips, was what began to draw eyes. Eyes that were curious, eyes that were irritated, eyes that would soon enough decide that a lesson needed to be taught. For now, though, Chuck simply played on, winning quietly, losing without flinch, the shadow of a storm just beginning to gather around him. The Mirage Royale had a way of feeding on whispers, of turning small moments into spectacle. Chuck's quiet winning streak was no longer invisible, though he never made a gesture to call attention to himself. His steady stack of chips, his calm eyes beneath the brim of his hat, and the way the dealer's hands seemed to move with unusual care when passing him, cards were enough to bend the attention of the floor in his direction. Not everyone noticed, but those who mattered did. The shadows in tailored suits, the kind of men who measured nights, not by drinks or winnings, but by who maintained control of the room, had begun to lean toward him like wolves, scenting something they didn't like. At first it was nothing, just the heavy glance of one man in a dark jacket standing near the ropes, the way he murmured something to his colleague while keeping his gaze fixed on Chuck's table. Chuck didn't return the look. He played on, sipping tea, his presence as steady as the ticking of a metronome. He had been in rooms like this before. He knew that silence and composure could sometimes provoke more than noise ever could. And in a place built on the illusion of control, there was nothing more dangerous than a man who refused to play by the unspoken rules of theater. One of the bodyguards, broader than the rest, with a neck like a tree trunk and hands that looked better suited for breaking concrete than shuffling chips, pushed himself from the booth. His drink was only half finished, but he no longer cared about the glass. He drifted toward the table where Chuck sat, his movements casual enough to look accidental, but his eyes carrying the weight of intention. He came to stand just behind Chuck's chair, as though pausing on his way across the room. He looked down at the cowboy hat, tilted his head slightly, and let out a low chuckle. "Not bad for an old-timer," he said, loud enough for the table to hear. "Guess even a blind horse finds water sometimes." The other players laughed awkwardly, unsure whether to take it as a joke or a warning. The dealer froze for a fraction of a second before continuing her routine, her professionalism masking a flicker of concern. Chuck placed his next bet without comment, sliding the chips forward with the same calm precision as before. He didn't even turn his head to acknowledge the man looming behind him. The silence was louder than words. The guards shifted, the absence of reaction prickling his ego like sand under skin. He smirked and stepped closer, brushing the back of Chuck's chair with his knee. The chair rocked slightly, but Chuck's posture didn't change. He sat as if anchored, as if his balance was his own and could not be borrowed or taken by someone else's weight. "Careful, cowboy," the man said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Wouldn't want to spill your tea." Chuck reached for his cup, lifted it, and took a sip. He set it down as though the words had been nothing more than air. The other players shifted uneasily, sensing the edge of something sharp beneath the calm. A second bodyguard arrived, taller, leaner, with slicked hair and a restless energy in his shoulders. He leaned an elbow against the table, close enough that the dealer had to shift her hands to keep dealing. His eyes moved over Chuck's chips with lazy contempt. "You've got a good pile there, old man. Shame if somebody decided you didn't earn it fair." The dealer's voice tightened as she said, "Sir, please keep your hands off the table." She knew how quickly these things could spiral. The Mirage Royale didn't like scenes, but scenes had a way of sprouting when men with power decided rules were for others. The tall guard ignored her. He flicked a fingertip across one of Chuck's chips, sending it spinning. The chip rolled toward the center of the table before the dealer quickly stopped it with her palm. Chuck's eyes followed the motion, but he didn't move. He placed his next bet as if nothing had happened, his hands steady, his face impassive. The third guard joined them now, younger, broad-shouldered, his suit stretched at the seams from muscles earned more in a gym than in work. He didn't say anything at first. He simply walked past the table, close enough that his hip brushed Chuck's arm. The contact was deliberate, a silent announcement that the circle had closed. The three men exchanged glances, small smirks curving at their mouths. To them, this was a game of dominance, of pushing until something broke. Most men would have risen, shouted, thrown a punch, or at least stammered a protest. Most men would have given them what they wanted, the spark that let them flex their authority in front of the crowd. Chuck gave them nothing. His stillness was unbearable. One of the players at the table, a nervous tourist in a rumpled shirt, shifted in his seat and whispered, "Hey, maybe you should." But he caught the cold glance of the nearest guard and swallowed the rest of his sentence. The dealer's eyes darted between Chuck and the men circling him, her lips pressed tight. The cocktail server returning with a tray hesitated when she saw the posture of the room, then wisely veered away. The crowd had noticed. They always did. A hush, subtle but growing, spread around the table as people leaned in with their phones, their drinks half forgotten. It was the kind of hush that announced something was about to happen, the anticipation of violence sweeter than the ring of jackpots. And in that hush, the bodyguards found their permission. The room had given them an audience, and an audience demanded a show. The thick-necked one bent closer, his breath hot against Chuck's ear. "You gonna just sit there, Grandpa? Or you gonna show us some teeth?" Chuck finally moved, but only to place another bet. His voice came low, almost conversational, though only the dealer could hear it clearly. "Cards don't bite," he said. His tone wasn't defensive, wasn't challenging. It was factual, calm, unmovable. But the words, simple as they were, struck the men as mockery. The second guard straightened, face tightening. He slapped the back of Chuck's chair so hard it made the table rattle. Chips clinked together, and the dealer gasped softly before catching herself. Phones lifted higher in the crowd. The tourists didn't know who the cowboy was, but they knew they wanted to see the climax of whatever story was writing itself in front of them. The tallest guard stepped forward now, his hand brushing the brim of Chuck's hat with the back of his knuckles. "Nice hat," he said. "You win that too?" The dealer froze, her eyes darting toward security at the edge of the pit. But no one moved yet. The Mirage Royale's guards had rules. They intervened late, not early, because nothing angered the house more than pulling a trigger before the audience had been hooked. And so they waited, watching, calculating the exact moment to step in, already too late. Chuck sat as still as stone, his tea steaming quietly at his elbow, his cards untouched in front of him. The tension coiled tighter, ready to snap, and still he gave them nothing. That refusal, more than any insult, was what stoked the fire. The first tension had come, quiet but undeniable, and the room was already shifting into orbit around it. The storm was not yet breaking, but its clouds had gathered, thick and heavy. Chuck had not moved, but by not moving he had drawn every eye and set the stage for what was coming. The men circling him did not yet understand that they were no longer in control of the game. They thought they were the predators, but the silence had betrayed them. The room already knew who held the real weight at that table. The slap on the back of the chair still seemed to reverberate in the air, the sound settling over the table like the first crack of distant thunder. The tourists who had gathered around knew instinctively that the situation was no longer a matter of chance or luck. It had shifted into something else, something sharper, something with teeth. They leaned closer, phones held higher, eyes fixed on the cowboy in the faded denim shirt, who somehow sat as calm as if the storm around him were no more than a summer breeze. Chuck didn't raise his voice, didn't rise from his seat. He simply reached for his cup of tea again, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer as he lifted it, took a sip, and set it down with the same precision as before. The serenity of the gesture seemed to mock the aggression that had begun to orbit him. The first bodyguard, the one with the bull's neck and fists the size of hammers, straightened with a low laugh. "You hear that? Man doesn't even flinch," he said to the others, his grin wide but his eyes tightening. "Thinks he's too good to answer." "Esum, he's not too good," the taller one replied, tapping his knuckles against the felt edge of the table. "He's just another lucky stiff who thinks the rules don't apply to him. We can fix that." He reached across suddenly, fast enough that the dealer gasped, and scooped a small stack of Chuck's chips toward himself. The clink of plastic against felt was sharp, obscene in its defiance. He weighed them in his hand like a child playing with marbles, rolling them between his fingers. "Doesn't look like much to me," he said with a sneer. "Guess beginner's luck runs cheap." The dealer's face tightened. "Sir," she said firmly, her voice cracking just slightly under the weight of the moment, "put those back. Now!" Her eyes flicked to Chuck, then away, as though she wanted to apologize for what she could not control. Chuck didn't move. He looked at the guard's hand, at the chips resting in it, and then back down at his own cards. His expression was the same calm mask as before. Neither anger nor amusement, only patience, like a man waiting for a page to turn in a book he'd already read. The crowd shifted closer, the hum of slot machines and roulette wheels fading behind the breathless anticipation of 100 spectators. This was the true entertainment of the night now, not the games of chance, but the game of power. A murmur ran through the watchers, part excitement, part disbelief, as the story wrote itself right before their eyes. The cowboy was the underdog, and the heavy suits were the villains. Everyone knew the shape of the tale, but no one could guess how it would end. That was why they stayed, cameras raised, breaths held. The younger guard, restless with the need to prove himself, stepped in next. His broad shoulders cut a shadow across the felt, his suit stretching tight as he leaned over Chuck, one palm slapping against the table near the cowboy's cards. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he said, his voice loud, sharp, echoing just enough to silence the nervous laughter of the onlookers. "Don't just sit there like some statue. You think ignoring us makes you bigger? Makes you stronger?" Chuck turned his head slightly, just enough that the brim of his hat shifted, casting a deeper shadow across his eyes. He said nothing. The silence landed heavier than any retort could have. The guard's jaw tightened, his lips curling into a snarl. He slammed his other hand against the back of Chuck's chair, rocking it forward sharply. Still, Chuck didn't move. He set his hand on the table, steadying his tea, making sure it didn't spill. That small, controlled motion seemed to mock the violence again, and the young guard's face reddened. The dealer swallowed hard. "Please," she whispered, voice shaking now. "Not here. Not at the table." But her words were lost in the growing swell of the crowd. Phones were out everywhere, lights blinking red to record, the watchers feeding the fire with their unblinking attention. The bodyguards felt it too. The audience wanted escalation, and men like them didn't know how to refuse when given a stage. The tallest one leaned closer, his lips near Chuck's ear. "You hear that, cowboy? They want a show. You gonna give them one, or do we have to?" He flicked one of Chuck's chips across the table like a coin, the plastic disc spinning and wobbling before coming to rest in front of the dealer. "Your move, old man." Chuck finally raised his eyes to the man's face, just for a second. They weren't angry, weren't frightened. They were steady, patient, the eyes of a man who had seen storms worse than this and had always walked through them untouched. That look alone seemed to unnerve the guard, though he covered it with a sneer. The bull-necked one clapped his hand down on Chuck's shoulder suddenly, gripping hard, squeezing as if testing the strength of the man beneath his palm. "Soft," he said with a grin, squeezing harder. "Just like I thought. Nothing but skin and bone. You don't belong here, cowboy." Chuck's hand reached calmly for his tea again, lifting it without effort even under the pressure of the man's grip. He drank, set it down, and let the silence stretch. The grip tightened, a vein bulging in the guard's forehead as he pressed harder, needing some reaction. Any reaction. The crowd was silent now, the tension thick enough to choke on. Phones leaned in closer, the watchers desperate to catch the exact second the old man broke. But Chuck didn't break. He simply placed his next bet, sliding a neat stack of chips forward, the gesture steady and unshaken. The dealer, her hands trembling, took the chips, dealt the next cards, her breath uneven. The guards laughed, but it was a strained laughter, forced and ugly, covering the prickle of unease in their chests. The cowboy wasn't supposed to be this calm. He wasn't supposed to make them feel small. The younger one straightened suddenly, fed up with the lack of reaction. He reached across the table, his hand darting toward Chuck's cards. "If you won't play right, then maybe we'll play for you." The dealer gasped and tried to intercept, but it was too late. The man's fingers brushed the edge of the cards, and in that moment Chuck's hand moved, so fast and so subtle that most of the crowd missed it. His palm shifted, redirecting the guard's wrist with no more effort than turning a page. The motion was quiet, almost invisible, but the effect was immediate. The guard stumbled, his balance tipping forward, his hands sliding across the felt in a clumsy sprawl. The tourists gasped, laughter erupting from the back rows of the crowd. Phones caught the image of the suited guard sprawling awkwardly across the table, while the cowboy sat unmoved, his hat still shading his calm eyes. The guard snatched his hand back, his face burning. "You think that's funny?" he growled, straightening quickly, but the laughter from the crowd had already branded him. His humiliation hung in the air, thick and undeniable. He glared down at Chuck, breathing hard, fists clenched. The bull-necked one stepped closer again, jaw tight, his hand still gripping Chuck's shoulder. "You just made a mistake," he muttered. "A big one." Chuck reached for his tea again, his movements as calm as ever. He sipped, set it down, and finally spoke, his voice low and even, carrying just enough to be heard by the men around him. "I don't make mistakes." The words weren't loud, weren't boastful. They were simple, factual, delivered with the same calm as everything else he had done that night. But in the ears of the guards, they landed like a hammer. The crowd's murmur swelled, the energy turning feverish. The guards had come looking for dominance, but instead they found themselves being measured by a man who didn't even need to rise from his seat to make them feel small. The escalation had arrived. The first sparks of violence had been lit. The crowd was hungry for more, and the guards were too deep in their pride to back away now. The stage was set, the storm gathering above the green felt of the blackjack table, and everyone in the Mirage Royale knew it could only end one way. Chuck sat still in the center of it, calm as stone, the quiet eye of the hurricane about to break. The silence at the table was unbearable, stretched so taut that every shuffle of cards and every nervous cough from the spectators felt like cracks forming in glass. The three bodyguards, now fully committed to their performance, circled Chuck with the restless energy of men who had tasted humiliation and needed to reclaim themselves in front of an audience. They had tried mockery, intimidation, and even small theft, yet none of it had unsettled the cowboy who sat before them. His stillness had become a mirror, showing them not the strength they imagined they possessed, but the weakness of their bluster. And nothing enraged such men more than being made to feel like a joke. The bull-necked guard finally lost patience. His grip on Chuck's shoulder, which had been meant as a test of strength, became a command. With a violent jerk, he wrenched at the fabric of the denim shirt, pulling hard as though to drag the cowboy up from his chair. But Chuck remained seated, as though the tug were no more than the tug of the wind. The effort threw the guard off balance for half a second, a misstep so small most didn't notice. But Chuck's eyes flickered upward briefly, and in that flicker the guard saw something that made his heart stumble. It was not defiance, not fear, but a calm that said the storm had already been measured and weighed. The taller one stepped in next, his frustration boiling. With a sudden explosive movement, he slammed his palm against the top of Chuck's hat and shoved downward, forcing the brim low, the crown of the hat pressing against Chuck's forehead as the guard tried to shove his head into the table. The dealer cried out and stepped back, scattering a few cards from her shoe onto the felt. The crowd gasped, phones rising higher, voices murmuring. Everyone expected the cowboy's head to slam down, his dignity crushed into the green cloth beneath the weight of a stronger man. But the head never touched the table. Chuck's hand lifted, 2 fingers resting against the edge of the felt, and with the smallest shift of balance, his spine bent just enough to absorb the force without giving into it. His other hand moved almost lazily, brushing against the guard's wrist, and suddenly the man's strength seemed to slip from him, like water poured onto stone. The shove that was meant to break became nothing more than pressure absorbed and redirected. Chuck straightened, the hat still in place, his face unmarked. The guard stumbled forward half a step, confused, his hand slipping from its hold. The laughter that broke from the back of the crowd was sharp and cruel. The younger guard flushed red, his jaw tightening, humiliated before the eyes of dozens who had captured his failure forever on their glowing screens. Pride, raw and wounded, flared hotter in his chest, and he lunged again, this time seizing Chuck by the collar with both fists. He yanked hard, dragging with all his weight, his muscles straining. Chuck rose an inch, no more, his chair scraping softly against the carpet, and then stopped as though rooted to the earth itself. The young guard's strength found no purchase. His arms trembled, his face contorted, and still the cowboy remained unmoved. "Come on!" the guard snarled, voice cracking with frustration. "Get up!" I tweeted that Chuck's eyes lifted slowly, his gaze locking onto the man's face. He said nothing. The silence was worse than words. The younger guard's rage boiled over. He wrenched harder, and with a guttural yell, he tried to slam Chuck forward, forcing him down into the felt in a brutal display of dominance. Chips scattered across the table, bouncing off the rail, clattering to the carpet. The dealer leapt back, hands to her mouth, the cards forgotten. For a heartbeat, it seemed the attack would succeed. Chuck's torso bent forward under the sudden force, his cheek nearly touching the green cloth. The crowd hissed, gasped, phones capturing the moment of supposed triumph. But then came the shift. With the faintest twist of his hips, Chuck redirected the momentum. His forearm pressed softly into the edge of the table, his body aligning with the push rather than against it. The young guard's weight carried itself past its target, unbalanced, uncontrolled. Chuck moved just half an inch more, and suddenly the man found his own wrists twisted, his knuckles pressed against his own chest as though he were embracing himself in a clumsy parody. "What?" he began, but the word ended in a grunt as his elbow locked awkwardly and pain sang up his arm. He released Chuck's collar and staggered back, clutching his wrist, his pride unraveling faster than the pain could settle. The crowd roared with laughter, their earlier gasp turning into a wave of cruel delight. The bull-necked one, furious at his comrade's humiliation, took over now. He stepped in, shoving past the other, and wrapped his thick arm around Chuck's shoulders in a crushing grip, pulling tight as though to squeeze the breath from him. His other hand pressed against the back of Chuck's neck, forcing downward again. "Down you go," he growled through gritted teeth. "Let's see what's left of you when the floor's your pillow." Chuck exhaled slowly, his chest expanding into the arm that sought to imprison him. He let the pressure settle, let it become part of him, absorbing it until it was no longer an attack, but a conversation between bodies. He bent forward slightly, his cheek hovering just above the felt, his breath stirring the edges of the cards scattered across the table. His hand rested open on the green cloth, fingers spread, his body relaxed. To the crowd, it looked for a moment as though he had given in, that the old cowboy had finally bowed under the weight of stronger men. Then his body shifted again, so subtly it was nearly invisible. A breath, a tilt of the ribs, a whisper of movement in his hips, and suddenly the arm around his shoulders was no longer a prison, but a lever. The bull-necked guard's own strength betrayed him. His grip slipped, his balance faltered, and in the blink of an eye, Chuck had turned sideways. The man's wrist bent back, his elbow folding against itself like the hinge of a poorly oiled gate. The guard gasped, his breath escaping him in a surprised growl as his own body carried him where he hadn't intended to go. Chuck rose then, not explosively, but inevitably, as though the earth itself had lifted him. His hand found the edge of the table for balance, and in the next instant he was standing upright, calm, composed, his hat still in place. The bull-necked guard stumbled back, his arm cradled against his chest, his teeth clenched against the shock of being undone. The crowd erupted, cheers and laughter rising in waves, the neon lights glinting off a sea of raised phones. "Did you see that?" someone shouted from the back. "He didn't even hit him." The other two guards exchanged glances, their pride shredded, but their anger blazing hotter. One reached for Chuck's chest, shoving hard, trying to push him back onto the table. Chuck stepped aside, his boots sliding across the carpet in a smooth pivot, and the shove found nothing but air. The man stumbled forward, nearly colliding with the dealer, who shrieked and darted away. Chuck's hand brushed the man's elbow as he passed, and the touch redirected his fall into the padded rail of the blackjack table. He collapsed awkwardly against it, knocking over chips, his face contorted with rage and embarrassment. The young guard, red-faced, drew a breath through his teeth and charged again, fists clenched, ready to strike. But Chuck's shin intercepted the kick he launched, a simple block that landed with the certainty of iron. The young man winced, hopping back, his fists trembling with the effort to keep his anger from turning into fear. Chuck didn't follow. He didn't strike. He simply remained, steady, calm, his hands low, his eyes level. He was not fighting them. He was showing them their own movements, their own weight, their own mistakes. The casino floor had gone silent except for the laughter and cheers. Even the slot machines seemed quieter, their electronic jingles drowned out by the rising tide of human reaction. Dealers in other pits had stopped their games, leaning over to watch. Security lingered at the edge, tense but hesitant, unsure whether to step in or let the story finish writing itself. The bull-necked guard snarled, spittle at the corners of his mouth. He lunged again, wrapping both arms around Chuck in a desperate attempt to wrestle him into submission. "You're done!" he shouted. He wrenched hard, pulling with all the strength he had. Chuck bent with it, his knees soft, his balance flowing into the motion like water into a new channel. Then, with a small circle of his hips, he redirected it. The guard staggered, his momentum carrying him into the very table he meant to use as a weapon. His own forehead pressed into the felt, his body bent awkwardly, his face mashed into the green cloth in humiliating submission. Chuck's hand rested lightly on the man's wrist, guiding him but never forcing, a shepherd rather than an executioner. The crowd erupted into applause, whistling, shouting, their excitement peaking. To them, it was no longer just a confrontation. It was theater, a performance unlike anything they had expected when they walked through the neon doors. Phones flashed, cameras captured every angle, and the legend of the cowboy at the Mirage Royale began to write itself in real time across social feeds and whispered retellings. Chuck let go of the man, who staggered back, face red with fury and shame. The other guards hesitated now, their anger warping into something closer to fear. The crowd's laughter cut deep, deeper than any wound. They had wanted to humiliate the stranger, to show their strength at his expense. Instead, they were the ones left stripped of dignity, stumbling and red-faced before 100 witnesses. Chuck reached for his tea again, lifted it, and drank. He set the cup down gently, the porcelain clinking against the saucer in the renewed hush. His eyes scanned the table, not the guards, not the crowd, but the cards, as if nothing had changed. And perhaps for him, nothing had. The attempt at suppression had failed. What had begun as a test of intimidation had turned into a showcase of grace and control. The three men had tried to bend him, break him, crush him against the table, but they had been undone not by strength but by calmness, patience, and a mastery that turned their own violence back upon them. And though they did not yet realize it, the true weight of their defeat was not in their bruised wrists or strained muscles. It was in the eyes of the crowd, in the laughter that branded them, in the knowledge that their power had cracked and been replaced by a legend unfolding before neon lights. The air in the Mirage Royale was charged, alive with the kind of restless energy that made gamblers forget their chips and dealers forget their routines. The failed attempt to press the cowboy's head into the felt had left the three bodyguards staggering in the kind of silence that wounds pride more deeply than fists. Chuck stood where he had always stood, steady and calm, as though he had simply shifted with the flow of a breeze, rather than turned aside the violence of men built like pillars. He didn't look like a victor. He looked like a man who had never been in danger at all, and that fact unsettled the guards more than their bruised wrists or jarred elbows ever could. The crowd felt it too. At first they had gasped, then laughed, then cheered. The noise of 100 phones capturing every flicker of movement and every failed attempt at dominance. What had begun as a confrontation had transformed into theater. Every onlooker was now a witness to something unforgettable. 3 large men in expensive suits, humiliated one after another by a cowboy who hadn't even raised his voice. The bull-necked guard shook out his arm, trying to pretend his wrist wasn't aching from the lock it had been caught in. The younger one rubbed his shin, the sting of blocked kicks still fresh. The tallest one glanced around the crowd, seeing the laughter etched into every face, and his pride burned so hot he felt it clawing at his throat. They had come to intimidate, to silence, to remind the room who was master here. Instead, they were the ones being laughed at, their every motion turned into farce by the calm patience of a man who didn't even look at them as enemies. The younger one couldn't stand it any longer. His face blotched crimson, his breath ragged, he lunged across the table again. This time he swung wide, a fist aimed for Chuck's chest. It was a clumsy, desperate strike, the kind of blow that looked powerful, but carried more anger than precision. Chuck didn't even step back. His body shifted just enough, a small rotation of his shoulders, and the fist slid past him into empty air. Chuck's hand touched the young man's wrist for less than a heartbeat, a gentle redirection, and the guard found himself stumbling sideways, his momentum unspent, carrying him across the felt. He crashed into the padded rail, scattering chips and knocking over a drink someone had left behind. The crowd erupted into laughter, the sound like thunder rolling across the neon night. The tall guard cursed under his breath, his pride unraveling. "Enough of this," he snarled. He bent low, his hand darting for Chuck's hat, thinking perhaps if he could snatch it away, he could at least peel away the calm mask that seemed to mock him with every breath. But as his fingers brushed the brim, Chuck moved. His head tilted slightly, his hand lifting not to grab but to guide. And suddenly the tall guard's own hand was pressed flat against his chest, the hat untouched. The man blinked in shock, as though the laws of balance had betrayed him, and then he stumbled back into the dealer's rail, his shoulder knocking the cards from her shoe. The dealer gasped, stepping quickly aside. "Please stop this," she cried, her voice thin and frightened, but the guards no longer heard her. They were deaf to anything but the laughter of the crowd and the calm presence of the cowboy they could not shake. The bull-necked one, roaring now, stormed forward. His arms opened wide, seeking to grab Chuck around the torso and crush him in a bear hug, to show once and for all that raw power was stronger than calm skill. He collided with Chuck's chest, arms locking, muscles bulging, pulling with all his strength. For a moment the crowd thought the cowboy had finally been caught, trapped in the grip of a man twice his bulk. But then Chuck exhaled slowly, his breath steady, his weight shifting in a small circle beneath the crushing hold. His hands rose just enough to press lightly against the guard's elbows. The motion was so small, so fluid, it seemed impossible. But the effect was immediate. The giant's grip loosened, his own arms pried apart by his momentum. With a step and a twist, Chuck turned, and suddenly the bull-necked guard was no longer holding him at all. He was bent over the blackjack table, his face pressed into the felt, his body pinned not by strength, but by the inevitability of his own motion. The room exploded. Applause, laughter, cheers, shouts filled the air, the neon lights bouncing off the mirrored ceiling as though the whole casino itself were laughing. The guard grunted, struggling, his face turning red against the green cloth, but Chuck simply let go and stepped back. The man stumbled upright, humiliated, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be serious," a tourist near the front whispered to his friend, phone raised high. "He's not even trying." Chuck adjusted the brim of his hat and returned to his chair, lifting his cup of tea as though he were no more than a tired man enjoying a quiet evening. He sipped slowly, set the cup down, and folded his hands loosely on the table. The guards hovered, shaken, breathing hard, their pride in tatters. But pride is a dangerous thing. It does not retreat quietly. The younger guard, desperate to reclaim a shred of dignity, glanced at the crowd and then at his comrades. He could not let the story end like this. He rushed forward again, this time snatching a chair by its backrest. The wooden leg screeched against the carpet as he hefted it high above his head, his breath ragged, his eyes wild. Gasps filled the air, phones pivoting to catch the moment. "This ends now!" he shouted. Chuck stood as the chair came down in an arc of fury. He didn't step back. He stepped forward inside the swing, his hands rising like the wings of a bird. One palm pressed against the underside of the chair, the other guided the guard's elbow, and the arc of destruction melted into a soft descent. The chair touched the carpet as gently as if being set down for a child, its violence disarmed, its weight absorbed. The guard's body followed, his balance tilted, his breath leaving him in a grunt as Chuck's exhale guided him down onto the felt once more. The room roared, a standing ovation of disbelief and joy. The humiliation was complete. 3 guards, men who ruled the floor through fear and muscle, now reduced to a circus act undone by the calm redirections of a cowboy who hadn't so much as raised his voice. The bull-necked one staggered back, clutching his wrist. The tall one rubbed his shoulder, and the young one lay gasping on the felt, his chest heaving. Around them, the crowd cheered, clapped, whistled, their phones recording the legend as it unfolded. Dealers leaned forward in awe. Waitresses froze mid-step with trays in their hands. And even the pit bosses, those unflappable guardians of the house, stared with wide eyes. Chuck did not gloat. He did not smile. He simply stood, calm and steady, his breath even, his hat still shading his eyes. He turned back to his chair, lifted his cup, and drank again, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer in the thunder of applause. The humiliation of the guards was not in the bruises or the aches of their bodies. It was in the laughter of the crowd, in the applause that rang through the casino like a bell, in the knowledge that they had been measured and found wanting before the eyes of everyone who mattered. They had tried to crush a man and had instead been unmade, their pride scattered like the chips that still lay across the floor. The Mirage Royale had seen many nights of violence, many scuffles, many displays of power. But this was different. This was not a fight. It was a lesson, and the lesson was clear. True strength was not in fists or fury, but in the calm control of a man who needed neither. And though the guards did not yet know it, the night was not finished with them. The crowd's hunger for resolution would not let the story end here, and pride, once wounded, always comes back for more. The echoes of laughter still trembled in the mirrored ceiling when silence began to fold itself back into the casino's rhythm. The applause, the cheers, the whistles, all of it softened into a hum that mingled with the jingling of slots and the steady shuffle of cards. The Mirage Royale, like any beast that lived on spectacle, absorbed what it had witnessed and carried on, though a different kind of current pulsed through its veins now. The floor was alive with whispers, every gambler and tourist retelling in their own words what they had just seen. A cowboy had walked in, sat down for a quiet game, and turned 3 predators into a sideshow without raising his voice or breaking a sweat. Chuck lowered himself back into his chair, adjusting his hat with the same patience he had carried since the moment he stepped through the neon doors. His tea had cooled, but he sipped it anyway, savoring the last of it as though the storm hadn't just broken at his table. His eyes never searched for approval, never acknowledged the audience still buzzing around him. He had returned to where he had started, a man alone with his cards, his chips, and his silence. That was what unsettled the guards most of all. He hadn't just beaten them. He hadn't even needed to treat them like adversaries. To Chuck, they had been like wind against a mountain felt, absorbed, but never a true threat. The 3 men staggered back toward the edge of the floor, their suits disheveled, their pride shattered, their faces burning with humiliation that no amount of scowls could cover. Their presence had always commanded space, but now the crowd closed in on them, phones raised like torches, recording every twitch of their wounded dignity. The tall one muttered curses under his breath. The young one clenched his jaw so tightly it looked as though his teeth might crack, and the bull-necked one stared holes into the cowboy, his fists opening and closing, the veins in his forehead pulsing. They might have come again. Pride would have driven them, desperation would have carried them, but the Mirage Royale had its own guardians. A pair of house security officers in black suits appeared at the edge of the pit. Their approach smooth, deliberate, their hands raised just enough to suggest calm, but firm enough to warn that any further escalation would be crushed swiftly. The pit boss, sweat glistening at his temple, whispered into his headset, his eyes darting nervously between Chuck and the broken circle of guards. He was a man who had seen trouble of every kind, but what he had just witnessed unsettled him more than any brawl. Fights he understood. This quiet mastery was something else entirely. The crowd, reluctant to let the story end, lingered around the table. Tourists leaned against each other, whispering about martial arts, about legends, about whether the cowboy was an actor or a ghost from some old movie reel. A woman in sequins clutched her friend's arm and whispered, "Did you see the way he moved? Like he didn't even move at all." Her friend nodded, eyes wide, replaying the image of the young guard's chair swing dissolving into nothing but a gentle lowering to the carpet. It would become a video loop online before the hour was out. The moment stripped from its context and turned into proof of something people wanted to believe. That grace could undo rage. That silence could undo noise. That a cowboy could still walk into a palace of neon and write a new legend without meaning to. The dealer, pale but steady, began to gather her scattered cards. Her hands shook for the first few seconds. But as she returned the deck to order, she caught Chuck's eye. He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture of quiet reassurance. She exhaled, her lips tightening into a small, grateful smile, and turned back to her work. To her, the storm was over. To the crowd, it was still unfolding. The bull-necked guard tried one last time, his voice hoarse with fury. "This isn't over," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at Chuck, though he dared not step closer. "You hear me? You don't embarrass us in our house and walk away. You'll see us again." His words rang hollow, drowned in the laughter that rippled across the crowd. He had intended them as a threat, but they landed as a confession, a desperate cry from a man who had already lost the audience. Chuck didn't rise to meet him. He didn't even look at him. He lifted his tea again, drank, and set the cup down with the same quiet finality that had carried him through every moment of the night. Only then did he speak, his voice low, calm, carrying just far enough to cut through the noise. "You've already lost enough tonight. Don't lose more tomorrow." The guard stiffened, his jaw tightening, but he said no more. Security moved in, their presence firm but not violent, and guided the three men away. The crowd parted like water, swallowing them up in a tide of laughter, applause, and the faint click of chips being dealt again. The Mirage Royale exhaled. The storm had passed, leaving behind stories that would ripple through the city for months, maybe years. Chuck leaned back in his chair, folding his hands, and allowed the room to settle around him. The applause dwindled, replaced once more by the rhythm of cards, dice, and spinning wheels. Dealers resumed their routines, cocktail servers floated by with their trays. Gamblers leaned over their chips, hungry for the promise of fortune. To anyone just walking in, the casino looked as it always had. But to those who had been there, to those who had seen, it would never look the same. A young man in a leather jacket, still clutching his phone, stepped closer to the table. "Sir," he said hesitantly, his voice carrying the awe of someone who wasn't sure if he was speaking to a man or to a legend. "That was incredible. You didn't even—" He cut himself off, unsure of the words. Chuck's eyes flicked toward him, calm, steady, neither welcoming nor dismissing. "Play your game," he said gently. "The cards are waiting." The young man nodded quickly, embarrassed but smiling, and returned to his seat at another table. The whispers spread again, the audience reluctant to leave, clinging to every fragment of what they had just witnessed. The cowboy had spoken, and in his quiet words they heard something larger than a fight. The Mirage Royale had always been a place of noise, of spectacle, of money shouting its way across the veldt. But that night, for a brief moment, it had been a place of silence too. Silence that spoke louder than fists. Silence that turned three guards into clowns. Silence that left the crowd applauding, not for violence, but for grace. Chuck rose at last, gathering his chips into a neat stack, pushing a generous portion toward the dealer as a tip. She looked at him with wide eyes, her lips parting as though to thank him, But he only shook his head slightly. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need recognition. He simply needed to leave his chair the way he had found it, untouched, unbroken, ready for the next story. He walked through the casino with the same calm stride that had carried him in, his boots pressing against the carpet with the sound of inevitability. The crowd parted for him again, not because they were forced, but because they wanted to. Phones followed him, whispers chased him, but he did not look back. He passed the roulette wheels, the slot machines, the chandeliers, until the neon doors swung open ahead of him. The desert night breathed cool air against his face, carrying the faint scent of dust and electricity. Behind him, the Mirage Royale hummed on, its machines singing, its dice rolling, its stories multiplying. But one story had already been written into its walls, into its mirrors, into the red and gold fibers of its carpet. A story that would be told in bars, on sidewalks, across dinner tables, of a cowboy who came to play, not to fight, and left a lesson behind without ever raising his hand. Chuck paused just outside the doors, tilting his hat back slightly to look at the velvet sky. The city glowed behind him, restless and loud, but for a moment he felt only the quiet. He breathed it in, then walked forward into the night, leaving the Mirage Royale to hum its endless song, a river of neon carrying a new legend downstream. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Check out our other videos packed with twists you won't see coming. And if this one shocked you, share it with your friends. Let them get hooked too.